Today we continue with a question of redemption. Can the modern state of Israel be the beginning of redemption? God willing it is. And we're dedicating this series to the memory of Izzy Kaplan, a tzaddik in our own time.
My mother's in
And to
Nechama bat Avraham.
Nechama bat Avraham, that her neshama should have an aliyah. It's her yard site coming up. Can the redemption come about through people who fail to keep God's commandments? This is the very central question, right? Is it possible that those people who are not Shomer Shabbos, who are eating, heaven forbid, cheeseburgers or whatever, right? You know, is that what the intention was after 2,000 years? That's how this holy land will be founded, by such people? Mm-hmm. Shouldn't it all be by tzaddikim? That's the question, right? The ways of redemption. When Jews dreamed of redemption in the past, they certainly did not imagine it unfolding in its present form. Everyone believed that a righteous, God-fearing king would deliver the nation and generate a sweeping spiritual revival among the people, causing all of Israel to observe the mitzvot and become righteous Torah scholars. Now, please remember that this book was originally published roughly 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Okay. However, to think that God would execute the redemption as we see fit is extremely reprehensible. That is, if we're the ones who are going to judge how God should bring redemption, that doesn't seem appropriate, any more than it would seem appropriate if we decided, I don't like the way God created the universe. It can't be. It's not the right way. You know, why did he create a nakash, a snake? It's the wrong way to do it. Mm-hmm. These are judgments that are inappropriate, just as much as it's inappropriate to say, God, you can't bring redemption in this way. By the way, if anybody wants some water, please help yourself. Ezra, do you want to pass that to Masha?
Yeah, it's okay. You have my drink here. Special.
However, to think that God must execute the redemption as we see fit is extremely reprehensible. For my thoughts, and this is a quote from Yeshaya, right? For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways, says the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Don't try to outsmart God. The redemptive process from its very inception has always followed the path that is furthest from our expectations. It's not how one might have expected it to be. Even if you think back to, the story of redemption from Egypt. Mm-hmm. It's strange that a prince of Egypt would be the one to lead the slaves out of Egypt. You would think it would be, the Roman story connected to another religion, Spartacus, is about a slave who leads a rebellion. Right. That makes sense to us. But our story is somebody who was second from the crown, third from the crown of Egypt, actually betrayed his country, and led the slaves out of Egypt. It's a very strange choice for a leader. Kind of and we know that the slaves doubted him throughout the whole time in the Midbar. There were questions about his legitimacy. Yeah. And in fact, they only began to believe in him not after 10 plagues. It says that after, what did they begin to believe in Moshe?
Splitting of the sea.
What?
Splitting of the sea after
that's right.
And the soldiers were died.
That's right. We say this every day, the Song of the Sea, right? Is that they began to believe in God and Moshe, his servant, only after the sea was split. Mm-hmm. And by the way, even after that, they continued to have doubts, as we know.
No, their behavior in the desert. Yes.
But then you can look at, that answers a bit of a question. Like the Jewish people weren't following Hashem, or they weren't in the most righteous state when Hashem brought them out of Egypt. So he wasn't waiting for them to be tzaddikim, they're still his children, he still brought them out.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. That's right. In fact, we specifically know that they were brought out of Egypt not in their own merit, that they had virtually no merit at that point. They were brought out of Egypt because of a promise God had made to the Avot, to their great-great-grandfathers. He keeps his promises. And also, he needed the Jewish people as part of God's plan to accomplish his goal. And so he brought them out while they were still Jewish people. And they might not have been had he waited much longer. They might have been absorbed into Egypt.
Yeah, because he had to give the Torah.
The origins of royalty. Let us begin the origins of Mashiach's paternal ancestor. In Parsha Vayishev, in Bereshis, we read the perplexing story of Yehuda and Tamar. When elementary school teachers teach this story, they grope for ways to relate it to their students. It's unpleasant to imagine how this story would be portrayed if it were to happen today. I remember when my son was in grade 2, I think it was, that the Rebbe tried to explain this story, and his explanation was Yehuda was married to Tamar for one day. That was his explanation for it, right? Because it's obviously very awkward to tell a 7-year-old, frankly, about prostitution, right? Which is what it was, right? Tamar had her reasons, right? God had his reasons for why this was going to happen the way it did. But Pshat, she dressed as a temple prostitute. He didn't have any money, so he exchanged her sexual favors for his cloak and his ring and his staff. When his servant came to pay the prostitute after the shearing of the sheep, because he didn't have any cash with him, wealthy people often don't carry cash, right? The president can't afford to buy his own hamburgers, it turns out, because he doesn't have cash. The Secret Service pays for it. When the servant came back to pay the prostitute what was owed, and to take back the cloak and the ring and the staff that had been left with her, she had disappeared and nobody knew anything about such a person. Later on we find out that it was Tamar, and we'll see it goes. Chazal expressed this very strange... Certainly no one expected anything positive or sacred to come out of this. Quite surprisingly, however, Peretz, the progenitor of King David, the man descended from Peretz, it says in Tehillim, and Israel's entire royal dynasty, and in fact, Mashiach yet to come, was born from this strange union, this questionable union of Tamar and Yehuda. Chazal expressed this blaring contradiction as follows. The sages say, at that time, this is a quote from Bereshis, at that time Yehuda went down from his brothers. Right? This was after Yosef had been sold into slavery, and Yehuda, who was the leader of the brothers, not the eldest, but he was the one destined for kingship, right? It says he descended, meaning that physically he went down, but also in their eyes he went down. And it says, Yehuda has betrayed, and an abomination has been done. It says Malachim. Said God, you have denied, Yehuda. You have lied, Yehuda. And an abomination has been done in Israel. Yehuda has been profaned, for Yehuda has profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loved. Yehuda's behavior seems to have been very inappropriate for a king. Reb Shmuel, the son of Ben Nachman, the son of Nachman, said, for I, God, know the thoughts, and he quotes Yirmiyahu, that's from Yirmiyahu. The tribes were busy selling Yosef. This is from Bereshis Rabbah. What was going on at that time, right, when this experience happened with Tamar, right? It seems to be that the story of Tamar and Yehuda is injected into the sale of Yosef. It's like a side plot that comes in, it's told to us, right? So how does Bereshis Rabbah see it? It says that the tribes were busy selling Yosef. Yosef was busy mourning and fasting. Reuben was busy mourning and fasting. Yaakov was busy mourning and fasting. Yehuda was busy taking a wife for one day. And the Holy One, blessed be He, was busy creating the light of the Messianic King. Although the Midrash reproaches Yehuda for his deed, God created the light of Mashiach from it. David HaMelech, King David, did not have questionable lineage from his father's side alone. It gets more complex. His maternal line also came from quite unexpected source. We would have expected Mashiach to be born into a prominent, well-bred Jewish family. Who would have thought that he would be descended specifically from Gentiles, a family of converts? Is there a shortage of good Jewish families who are more deserving of the honor? Ruth, David's great-grandmother, was no ordinary convert either. She came from Moab, one of the most despised nations from the Torah's perspective. It says in Devarim, an Ammonite and a Moabite shall not enter the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, shall not enter the congregation of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on your way out of Egypt, and because he, Moab, hired against you Bilam, the son of Beor, to curse you. Some say that Ruth was the great-granddaughter of Balak, actually.
So David's mother was from Ruth?
So, yeah. So David, on his father's side, is descended from Yehuda and Tamar, which is an inappropriate... Tamar was his daughter-in-law, right? And on his mother's side, right, it was from Ruth, right, and Boaz, right? Ruth was born a Moabite, we hold Moabite princess, right? And she is probably the prototype of the convert, of the sincere convert. Remember, she said, "Thy people are my people, thy ways are my ways, thy God is thy God, and I will be, and I will go as you go." But, you know, King David, when he described, you know, who his mother was and who his father was, probably couldn't get into most Orthodox schools today. I would say there'd be a lot of questions about, you know, his background and his behavior, right? And in fact, in his own time, there were many questions about his behavior, and we understand that one of the purposes that Shmuel wrote Sefer Rus, right, was actually to clarify the halacha, right? And if you look at it carefully, there's a very kind of clear, at the end of the story, halachic discussion that Boaz has with everybody else, and they all accept that this is proper. Why? Although you're forbidden to marry into Moab, right? The decision was you cannot marry a male Moabite because the male Moabites were responsible for the lack of hospitality, right? Females were not expected to go out with bread and water for the hospitality, but the men were. And so the consequence was that the interpretation was you cannot marry, and when it says 10 generations, it virtually means forever, into the tribe of Moab, right? So David's great-great-grandmother, Ruth, was the beginning of a change in the halachic interpretation. And we know that, in fact, one of the characters in the book of Ruth says, yes, I'll marry her. After all, you know, she has, you know, Naomi has land that I can have, right? And then when Boaz says, but you have to understand, you don't just get the land, you get her. She's your wife. And he says, well, you know, I'm rethinking this a little bit. No, you know, my reputation will be ruined if I marry this Moabite, so I'm not going to do it. Right, which was what Boaz was hoping for, because he did want to marry her. So here it says, because A, they didn't go out to for hospitality, and B, they hired Bilam, the son of Beor, to curse you. The wicked nation wanted to destroy the Jewish people, so they sent their daughters out to seduce the Jewish men. Therefore God decreed that they would never be allowed to marry into the Jewish nation. How then did Boaz marry Ruth? Tradition had it that only the male Moabites were forbidden, not the females. But not everyone accepted this, and both Ruth and David had difficulty getting married until this halacha was finally mandated after generations of debate. So it's interesting that even King David, there was some questions about whether he could get a shidduch.
I read somewhere that Jesse, all his life, wondered if he was truly a Jew. Like he felt like he was, in his heart, like maybe he wasn't a true Jew or a second-class citizen. Maybe people looked down on him because there's probably people said things.
Yeah, they mumbled.
And
This
he
was
never confident about
David's father.
who he was.
Yishai, yeah. That's right. That's right. And David actually, in the Tehillim that we read right now, just prior to Rosh Hashanah, he has a lot of issues about his heritage, and he cries about it. Mm-hmm. Besides all this, the Moabite nation came into existence under very shameful circumstances. Mm-hmm. An incestuous union between a father and his daughter, Moav, right, of the father, from the father. Mm-hmm. And this daughter wasn't even ashamed to publicize her misdeed, calling her son Moab from the father. This, of course, is the story of Lot and his daughter, his two daughters. Mm-hmm. From those two daughters came Ammon and Moab, right? Mm-hmm. So what we have is that David is descended from an incestuous relationship on one side, prostitution on another, and conversion from a very questionable tribe as well, right? And David is not only the prototype of the king in, by the way, to virtually all nations. When they think of who I want to be like, right, the description is always David. When they talk about a divine right king, it means that they're able actually to trace their lineage in some kind of strange way back to King David. That means the House of Windsor that rules England, right? Mm-hmm. And Luxembourg and the Kaiser in Germany and the Tsar, in St. Petersburg, all were able to trace their lineage back to the King David, right? They could hate Jews, they could be anti-Semitic, but they said, we can trace our lineage back to David. And the only way you can be a divine right, the only way you can be a divine right ruler, is if you are descended from a king who is anointed by a prophet. Mm-hmm. You can't become a divine right ruler just because God told me I should be the ruler. Nobody claims that. They all claim descent from a king who was anointed by a prophet.
But they claim
that is the requirement. Mm-hmm. So you can be anti-Semitic and still love King David and consider him your great-great-grandfather.
David was anointed by his
Samuel.
With Samuel, Shmuel.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's a key thing to remember always. This is nature. This king, who is the prototype for all kings in history, is not only a prototype for that, but we hold very strongly that the Mashiach, he should come in our time very soon, right, is a descendant from Ishai and David, right, a sprout of Ishai, right. So this is our prototype of who brings redemption. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Yeah. Would we have expected King David to be born under such circumstances filled with sin and iniquity? If that's not enough, David's successor, King Shlomo HaMelech, Solomon, entered this world in an unexpected way. Shlomo's mother was Bathsheba, the woman who David originally took in a sinful manner. Right? Yeah. David repented for this misdeed, but did Jewish kingship have to emanate specifically from such an episode? People will tell you that, and they will quote to you that David didn't sin, and there's a Gemara that says David didn't sin, but we always have to remember that this is not the book saying David sinned, and this is not David Ostriker saying David sinned. David said he sinned, and the prophet Nathan said he sinned, and David paid a terrible, terrible, terrible penalty for the sin, and Nathan said he would. The child was lost, and blood never left the house of David because of this. So one would have to say, if he did not sin, then God is very unjust. And we know not only is God just, but he's merciful. So David, when Nathan said to him, you are the one who sinned. Unlike King Saul, who had preceded David, David didn't make any excuses. He immediately said, I have sinned. I have sinned against God. And he sat in ashes and sackcloth, right, and prayed for forgiveness, right. God loved David very much, and David, it's very interesting we're telling the story now because we're in the middle of the month of Teshuvah, of Elul, that precedes the Day of Judgment, Rosh Hashanah. David really is, as an individual, our model of tshuva. Other religions tend to have leaders that are without sin. We do not. We have leaders who have blemishes, and their strength is their admission of the blemishes, a determination to repair the damage and not to repeat it. Yes.
The question, when David did repent and he was suffering all the time, even all his Tehillim, he is always suffering, like with all that feelings and that, how much when he understood what's going on. The whole book is like has every sentence, the pain that David carries in his soul. The question is, did King Solomon, Shlomo, did he repent? Did he suffer also from his behavior? Do we have anywhere?
Read Ecclesiastes.
No, I read Ecclesiastes several times.
Clearly, Solomon suffered terribly in his life. His view was, I had everything in the material world.
Right.
And I was given great gifts of wisdom, right? And how I squandered it. And I ended up saying all is vanity.
So, and that's why we're seeing all the schmutz in the world that he all himself participated. That's why all his there is that whatever his outcomes of all these. He
at the end of his life he came to know what was valuable, right? And what was eternal and what was valuable, right? We say that poverty is a very difficult test, but in many ways wealth is a greater test. Now, I think we all long for that test. But nonetheless, we see that, people of great wealth often have terrible tsuras that goes with it. We wish that they did. We wish they didn't. We wish they didn't, right? And, I had a friend who did a TV series on lottery winners. And those are people who came into a great deal of money very suddenly. And it's 13 tragedies, literally. 13 shows. There's one tragedy after another about people's lives being destroyed by great wealth, right? So, Solomon, David was a simple man.
Right.
He was born a shepherd. He was the last of his family. It was a distinguished family, certainly, but, he was a working outdoors man. That's what he was, right? Solomon grew up with all of the comforts and all of the political intrigues that go with the palace, right? But clearly their challenges were very different. Let's move on. So these are, our line of our messianic line, right? This is the bloodline of Mashiach for us. Another Jewish leader. So now we're going to move forward a little bit, or backward in history. Another Jewish leader arose in an unexpected fashion. We hold that the first real king of Israel was actually Moshe Rabbeinu. That his role, and of course he was also the high priest for a little while. He was also the Sanhedrin for a little while. Moshe Rabbeinu had all the roles rolled into one, but one of them was kingship. Okay? Moshe Rabbeinu was the product of a marriage that the Torah subsequently forbade. Amram and his aunt Yocheved. So it's prohibited in the Torah, Peshat, to marry your aunt. It's not allowed, right?
They didn't have Torah.
But, and, it's a curious thing because we always say, well, the Avos always kept Torah, right?
No,
but there are some exceptions to it, right? Moshe Rabbeinu was not one of the Avos.
I wonder if this was another mitigating factor why he couldn't enter the land. Like, Yaakov couldn't have two wives in the land of Israel. One had to die.
Right. We say that, yeah.
Just a thought. I don't
two
know.
Sisters. You couldn't
two
marry
sisters.
two sisters.
Sorry, two sisters. But and Who just know? Who knows? Just
So
not
why
far
Rachel? Yaakov. Yaakov shouldn't go to Israel.
No, but
He married.
No, he married no, but it's the second wife he took, even though he meant to marry Rachel. She was the second wife, so that was the one.
Guy's point is why did Rachel have to pay that?
Yeah,
price?
why
should Yaakov
why
pay
did he?
it?
That's
This
true.
is the male
That is a question. That
He
is
went
true.
back to the land. You may remember she didn't make it. Right?
Yeah.
Why he made? But he himself told it. The one who did the sin.
Although she did enter the land with him
She
too,
did.
right?
She died in
She
the
died
land.
in Bethlehem, right? Or just outside of Bethlehem, Ephrat, actually. Okay, and so Moshe Rabbeinu came from. He would have been, after the Torah is given, defined as a mamzer, as a child of an illegal relationship.
Cool.
Right? Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yeah, Moshe Rabbeinu.
Had the Torah already been given,
sure.
right? Okay. A child born from such a union after the giving of the Torah is considered to be illegitimate. Moreover, he grew up in a pagan house, Pharaoh's palace, and was raised as the son of the one who wanted to annihilate all Jewish males. Moshe spent most of his life among Gentiles, becoming an integral part of the Jewish people only after the age of 80. Right? So we understand that he had a connection, and that part of God's selection of Moshe, although one assumes that he selected him prior to his birth, was his behavior. And we know the midrashim of the sheep that he helped carry from the water that was thirsty, and God said, as you have taken care of Jethro's flock, so you will take care of my flock. And we know that he went out and he saw the Jews enslaved, and that he put his shoulder to the task and helped them in the mud pits, which is a very strange thing for an Egyptian prince to do. And he had to explain that to Paro when he got back, and he said, no, I did it because I set an example and they work harder if I'm with them, right? Because, there was a lot of questions, obviously, about Moshe all his life. We know the story about, did he choose the hot coals versus the crown of the king? Because people said, he is the one who will eventually seek your crown. Right? So he was tested, and they put the shiny crown on one side and the hot coals on the other, and they said, let's see what this little baby will do. And he began to reach for the crown, and Amalek moved his hand and he touched the coals, right? And he was burning his hand, and to cool it off, he put it in his mouth. And it says from this he developed a speech impediment, right. in fact, which we later hear about as one of his excuses for why I don't want this job. Give it to my brother. He speaks well. I'm not a very good orator, right? But as we see, as we're reading Devarim, by the time we get to Devarim, Moshe is not only a good orator, he may be the greatest of all time, in his final speeches. So Moshe spent most of his life among Gentiles, becoming an integral part of the Jewish people only at the age of 80. Is this how we would have imagined the birth and the upbringing of the man who transmitted the Torah to Israel, who first redeemed the Jewish people? The word redemption comes in here. He is the Redeemer of Israel from Egypt. Did anyone expect the Purim salvation to sprout from an intermarriage between Esther and Achashverosh? Now let's examine Israel's spiritual state during the previous redemptions. Okay, so we look at this sort of strange way that leadership is chosen by God for Israel. It's always, the first king of Israel, Shaul, was said to be without blemish, that he was like a pure tzaddik, that he was physically and spiritually head and shoulders above the people. Right? And it turns out that that's not who we choose for a king. We choose for a king somebody with, I think the expression is, somebody who has some skeletons in his closet. Right? Somebody who, the moment you think you're going to be superior to everybody else, remember your skeleton. Remember where you come from, right? You're where you are because God placed you in this position, not because of your merit, not because of your history. Leaving Egypt, the exodus from Egypt. Were all Jews God-fearing people at the time of the Exodus from Egypt? Absolutely. They were all 100% tzaddikim, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Did they all keep their ancestors' traditions meticulously? Of course they did. Yeheskel and Chazal, the sages, indicate the exact opposite was true. Citing the Midrash Mechilta, Rashi teaches that the Jews were steeped in idolatry at the time, lacking even one mitzvah in whose merit they could be redeemed. So let's talk about who the Jews were. We love to talk about their merit, right? They continued to wear Jewish clothes. Their fashion was unique, right? They continued with Jewish names, right? They spoke Hebrew, right? Then there's a couple of other things we say, that they didn't fib on one another, that they didn't, right? Those are the three basic things. There's something very big missing from that, right? Did they believe in God? It seems not. It seems they believed in many gods. They were, at the time of Exodus, they were idol worshippers. At the time in the Yam Suf, the Malachim complained to God, we know this, and they looked and they said, they're idol worshippers and they're idol worshippers. Why are you saving them?
But maybe
Right?
that's why they so easily succumb to the golden calf.
For sure that's true. For sure that's true. But are these the people that you bring to Har Sinai? Such people? Right? Are these the people who you redeem? Right? Do they deserve it? Right? The idea of sacrificing the lamb, right? We always talk about, this was to teach the Egyptians, right, that we could kill their god,
That's right.
right? And eat their god, right? The lamb was a god, right? It wasn't just the Egyptians that were being taught. We know that the 10 plagues was, the first 7 were for Egypt. The last 3 were a demonstration to the Jewish people as well, you know, in this story. After the 7th, the Jews could have left. And God hardened Pharaoh's heart and said, and I'm doing this now for the Jews themselves, that they should never forget this time. Right? And when it came time to bring this calf, right? You know, sorry, the sheep, right? The sheep, right? It wasn't just the Egyptians that were having to overcome some things there, right? And we know the tragedy of it is that 20% of the slaves in Egypt decided to leave. 80% of them, we hold, 80% said, we're not so anxious to go off into the wilderness in a promise from this person. You know, it's not such a good idea. And God said, if you want to stay in Egypt, if that is your will, so be it. And during the plague of darkness, 80% of the Jewish people died and were buried. You know.
So only 20%
So
left to Egypt?
20% left Egypt. That's what we hold.
Hamushim. They left Egypt. Hamushim. People think it's Hamushim with
1/5.
It's Hamushim from the 5.
Right. It's 1/5. Yeah. That's where it comes from. God said, all right, this is Rashi. The time has come for me to fulfill my promise to Abraham and redeem his descendants. But they have no mitzvah to perform in order to be redeemed, for they are steeped in idolatry. So God made a decision independent of the merit of the Jewish people. Because of all the things that you could do wrong, certainly idolatry is like at the top of the list, right? And they were steeped in idolatry at this point. So God made a decision not on the merit of the Jewish people, but on his promise to Abraham and on his decision about the arc of history. The Jewish people had reached such a low spiritual plane that even Moshe Rabbeinu did not believe that they could be redeemed. He too thought that redemption cannot occur unless a nation is completely righteous. That's what Rashi tells us. Indeed, today's oft-repeated question, how can a spiritually debased people be worthy of redemption, has a basis. It's truly difficult to understand this. Even Moshe Rabbeinu had trouble with it at first. Nevertheless, redemption came specifically in this manner. We must also remember painfully that only a minority of the nation was privileged to leave Egypt. 80% died during the plague of darkness because of their sins and because of their desire to remain in Egypt. The Midrash Tanchuma quotes Reb Nehurai as saying that only 1 out of every 5,000 Jews left Egypt, and one opinion in the Gemara places the ratio at 1 in 300,000. It's a metaphor. Despite all this, the redemption began. Let us not forget that the plague of darkness in which the sinners perished was the 9th plague, and that descended upon the Egyptians. Even though Israel's spiritual state was very poor during the first 8 plagues, the redemption began and progressed. Right? So remember, during the first 8 plagues, when Pharaoh was saying, yes, they can go, no, they can't. Yes, they can, no, they can't. Yes, they can, no, they can't. 80% of the Jews were saying, hey, hold on. This radical wants to take us out. Regardless of what Pharaoh says, we're not going. We're not going out into that. It's craziness, right? There's a great scene in Lawrence of Arabia where Lawrence is leading the Arab nations, and he says, we're going to attack Aqaba, right? And how are we going to get there? We have to cross the desert. And nobody has ever crossed this desert. It's called the Devil's Anvil, right? So we can't do it. And Lawrence says, we will do it, right? And why will we do it? Because the guns of the British, or the Turks rather, are placed facing the Gulf of Aqaba, not facing the desert, because they know they can never be attacked by the desert. The desert is so dangerous that no army would ever try to go through the desert. And yet this is exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, right? We're going through the desert and we're going to go, okay, it's not a 40-year trip. It's a 12-day trip. But 12 days with virtually no water is an impossible trip. What is it? How long do you last without water? 2 days? Something like that?
Yes.
Something like 2-3 days, right?
Yeah.
So, when God was convincing Pharaoh that the Jews should leave, 80% of the Jews were saying, regardless of what he says, we're staying.
Nobody
In
wanted
the
to
Bible
die.
at that point, they said, 3 days.
We'll
No
be
water.
dead.
You
We'll be
know,
all
he
dead.
said, let us go 3 days and journey in the dead. So everybody's immuna was tested with that. That's where they got a bit of merit there.
Yeah. That's right.
Huh?
It says that, God says specifically, when describing his love for the Jewish people, that 20%, in Yirmiyahu, it says, my love for those who followed me out in their early days, in their youth, into an unsown desert. Right? That is to say, you rolled the dice with me. You didn't know what was going to happen. You trusted me, and I love you very much for that trust that you had in me in those early days. Right? And God specifically tells that to the prophet at this point. So let's look at the next period in Shoftim, in Judges. The judges inferred from this precedent, meaning the precedent of Egypt, that redemption is possible even when the nation is steeped in sin. The Spirit of the Lord was upon Othniel, Shoftim says. Reb Tanchuma expounded, Othniel examined what the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moshe in Egypt, I have surely seen the affliction. What?
Ra'iti,
Yeah, Ra'iti, the affliction of my people. Very often the same word is repeated twice. Not very often, but it's not uncommon that it's repeated twice. And we always have trouble with the translation when it's repeated twice. And usually we say things like, very much, or he saw very, very far, or he did this very much, right? Whenever God repeats something, he remembered to remember, right? Yeah. So he remembered something important. Do we understand that? But in fact, it's a very questionable translation. And so we'll see it here. When it says here, I have surely seen, is a bad translation. It says, I have seen, really is what it's saying here, right? The affliction of my people. What do the two seeings Re'eh and Re'iti represent. God said to Moshe, I see the Jews are eventually going to stray after the golden calf. Nevertheless, I have seen the affliction of my people. That's the second one. Thus, Othniel deduced, whether they are worthy or not, I must redeem them. This says Rashi, right? That is to say, I see what they did wrong, the golden calf, but I also see how much they suffered and how they could make such a mistake. And consequently, I am fulfilling the promise that I made. I hold on to my promises, and I will take them out. Gideon, another judge, declared, if our ancestors, this is so Jewish, I love this, right? He said, if our ancestors who left Egypt were righteous, let God save us in their merit. And if they were wicked, just as he performed wonders for them without reason, let him do the same for us. Right?
Yeah.
The Malbim explains that this is why Gideon asked God for a special sign before going out to war. He too thought that redemption will not take place when the nation is undeserving. Second Temple era. Scripture states clearly that the Jews who returned from Babylonia, with Ezra and Nehemiah, were extremely irreligious. Many of them, including the sons of officers and even the high priest, married foreign wives. They had forgotten the Torah so much, to such an extent, that they were unaware of the mitzvah to build sukkot, to build sukkahs, booths, on the holiday of Sukkah. You know, when you're in Israel today, and the 8 days of Sukkot come around, they're also called, what's the name? Is in the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles. Is that right? I think, yeah. Which is the harvest season. It comes after Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, right? You'll see that the restaurants are empty. Nobody's sitting in the restaurant. The only people sitting in the restaurant are people smoking cigarettes. Right? If anybody's eating, they're out in the street in a little hut that's been built, a little sukkah that's been built. Everybody does this. When the Jews returned from Babylon, now remember, we're not talking about 2,000 years, 70 years, a couple of generations. The length of time, by the way, that the communist empire survived virtually. Same kind of thing. Few generations, right? They had forgotten the mitzvah of sukkah. They had forgotten how to even build, that you even were required to build a sukkah, right? It's astounding if you think about it. Not only that, they desecrated the Sabbath openly, making it the market day in Jerusalem.
Wow.
You know, the government almost fell last week because railroad workers were doing work on the railroad on Shabbos. It was a scandal. The very foundations of the coalition was shaking about it, right? And here, you know, when Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, not only were businesses open, but it was the market day. It was the major shopping day in Jerusalem.
Shopping business.
Jerusalem HaKodesh. What were they doing? They said, it's market day. Shabbos is a good day for market day. To me, it's an astounding thing. The Talmud tells us that many of the returnees were the most wretched Jews possible. They were from illegitimate marriages. They had no parents. They were scallywags. Some of them even committed immoral sexual acts, like those of Sodom and Gomorrah. Did they have a Pride Day parade there? I'm not sure. Despite their shortcomings, however, God redeemed them and even held them in high esteem. Right? This is a very interesting thing. With all the things that we see here, many of the things we could complain about now. What?
I don't agree, because it didn't redeem them at this point. It just was promised that after a certain amount of years, Jews are going to come back. Time came, and who went to Israel? This kind of people.
Well, that means they have a great merit above all those who are Torah observing that stayed in Babylon. Someone said, "I observe Torah. I love Babylon." They say, "Well, I love nothing, but I love Israel."
It's exactly like happened in Israel today after 48.
Exactly.
Who came? People
without homes, without.
It's not that it was promised that people will come back.
Right.
And they came back.
No, in 48
Right.
people are coming of those who survived Holocaust.
That,
Yeah,
but that, by the way, that's
Who
part of the
built
point.
Israel, the modern
That's part of
state
the.
of
They
Israel?
didn't come before the Holocaust,
In
right?
the
They
30s,
were. They
lots of
could
people-
have.
No, lots
Just
of
as
people
we
were
could
coming
go
in the
today.
20s and the 30s,
Just
they
as
were
we.
rebuilding.
Very few came. Very
Well,
small
few.
numbers.
Well,
Very small numbers. It's
small
not true.
numbers because not everybody could reach. Not reach
Suddenly they were able to reach
Oh,
after
come
Shoah.
on. And those
The fact of the
after
matter
Holocaust,
is-
they could reach. They
and-
had money and they had health. They had
It was
everything.
British
The
mandate.
fact
It was
that-
very hard to
The
reach.
fact of the matter is,
No,
the
it was
people
not
who
easy
went,
to reach.
the people who went, right, who went and built things then, right, and this is something we all have to learn to accept, and we're going to see the numbers in huge percentages, right, were people from wealthy secular families, the people who had comfortable lives, part of religious communities in Europe, did not go. They did not go. Their numbers were tiny. And when we say
You're talking about before the war?
when they say that
Yeah,
yes,
you're talking, of
when they-
course,
when-
absolutely. I
when they
agree.
said they could not go, that's not really true. They chose not to leave the
They
comfort
chose- they
of their
assimilated
auras.
in Germany and all those countries.
When we talk to our grandchildren and great grandchildren, right, and say to them, what were you doing, in 2015 that kept you in Thornhill? It's going to be a tough explanation. It's going to be a tough explanation. And the answer is, it was more comfortable, and I was kind of uncomfortable and scared about what it meant, at my age or with my language skills, to move to Israel. Right? It's not a very strong excuse, right?
It's
And the
a lame
people,
excuse. It's called
and-
lame excuse, David.
that's right.
It's a lame excuse.
That's right.
We all
So
have-
when we say that, gee, they couldn't manage to go in those days, fact of the matter was, in the 1900s and the 1920s and 30s and 40s, right, there were people going and they were building the land, and they were not from religious communities. That's the reality. There were very small numbers. There were some. There were very small numbers, which is why. Well, we'll see. Actually, let's continue. So let's stay. We're still in the Second Temple here, right? We jumped ahead. We're going to. I guarantee you, we will get to all these questions eventually. But let's stay in the chapter we're on right now. The generation had its share of anti-Zionists as well. Reish Lachish, the Talmudic sage, asserts that the redemption in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah was short-lived only because of those Jews who refused to return to Zion. Right? Reish Lachish said the reason that the Mashiach did not come is because the Jews didn't return. We could have merited eternal redemption 2,500 years ago had all the Jews returned to Eretz Yisrael. Now this is really the tragedy of it all. Listen to what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, says. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi strongly denounced these slothful Jews in his classic Sefer HaKuzari. When the king of the Kuzars asks why the Jewish people do not ascend to Eretz Yisrael, the Kuzari is a story set in the 12th century, in which the Khuzar king, who is the king of a part of what today would have been part of the former Soviet Union, had an empire, and he had a dream. And his dream was that he is a righteous person, but what are righteous deeds? And he wanted to determine how to know the right path to follow. And so he brought before himself a philosopher and a Muslim and a Jew. And he let each one of them make their case for the true way. And as each one gave their reasons, it became clear to the Khuzar king that the right path was the Jewish path. He himself became Jewish and converted his whole nation. That's the history of the Khuzar story. Some people say it's a myth. Most people hold that there's a great deal of truth to it. So at this point, the Khuzar king, when the king of the Khuzars asks why the Jewish people do not ascend to Eretz Yisrael today, nowadays, in the 11th century, the Jewish sage who is answering these questions on behalf of the Jews, the rabbi, answers mournfully, "Alas, king of the Khuzar, you have exposed my point of disgrace. Indeed, this sin prevented the fulfillment of that which God had destined for the Second Temple. For divine providence was already to rest upon the Jews as at first, if they had willingly heeded the call and returned to Eretz Yisrael. However, only a minority took heed, while the majority, including most of the prominent among them, remained in Babylon, Babel, acquiescing to the exile and bondage just so that they would not have to part with their dwellings and businesses. They were living comfortably in Thornhill.
Material things, yeah.
If we would be prepared to draw near to God, the God of our forefathers, wholeheartedly, He would save us, as He saved our ancestors in Mitzrayim and Egypt. But since that is not the case," ready for this? It's painful. "But since that is not the case, our utterances of 'Bow at His holy mountain, bow at His footstool, who restores His presence to Zion,' etc., are like the chirping of birds, for we say these things without proper intent." Without proper intent. Thus, redemption does not always unfold as we think it should. The previous two redemptions began when the Jews were very deficient in mitzvah observance, and Chazal say that the third and final redemption may occur in a similar fashion. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it can even come to a generation that is completely corrupt. Rashim. The Netziv. The Netziv is part of the Brisker history, right? Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, publicized the following paragraphs in his book called Shvat Zion, a compilation of letters from great Torah authorities in favor of the modern-day return to Zion. This was he lived between 1817 1893. Right, and he was a preeminent scholar of his time and pious man, and he strongly supported Aliyah immediately. Right? Sadly, he wasn't listened to, although he ended up in Israel himself eventually.
So
in Palestine.
Rabbi Soloveitchik was related to him,
yes,
right?
yeah. The Briskers were.
Do you know
Right.
that his grandson is coming to Toronto? Great-grandson, Mayor Soloveitchik?
Yes.
September.
Yeah, I think nephew, actually.
Nephew?
I think great nephew.
Yeah, okay.
We must not speculate that this great matter, the resettlement, this is the Netziv writing, we must not speculate that this great matter, the resettlement of Eretz Yisrael, should have occurred differently, as people visualize in their mind's eye. Indeed, one must not express this opinion to God, as the prophet Ishaiah says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways are not my ways, says the Lord." We must not be overly wise and say that it has to happen in a different way. It's not for us to decide how redemption happens. It's God's decision. Ezra, the scribe, gathered a few thousand Jews in Babylonia, all types of people, a few great Torah scholars, God-fearing individuals, and also men who had foreign wives, people who regularly violated the Shabbos, and those who had no Torah knowledge whatsoever. These people worked together and prepared the land for settlement until it was eventually filled with its children. Remember what he's saying here. These people worked together and prepared the land for settlement until it was eventually filled with its children. We too must awaken to the sound of God's desire, which resonates from one end of the earth to the other, wherever our brethren are scattered, all types of Jews.
You have to resettle at land of Israel.
Right. So what the Netziv is saying is, first of all, don't outsmart God. God will decide how it's going to happen. See the miracle before your eyes and recognize it, number one. And number two, get on board.